maybe for me, it's sometimes I get distressed when I notice my favorite Netflix show is over now and I'll have to wait another, you know, another season before it shows up. So that can be mildly distressing because that's something I don't want. So this is sort of like, a basic description of stress. The important point to know is like it's a so it's a response that's encountered, primarily more tangibly in the body, but otherwise also experienced in, mentally and emotionally. Yeah, yeah. So you'll never notice like the stress is only in the body, and emotionally and mentally you're just perfect. So the mind, body, and spirit are connected. So if one is affected, the others are also affected. So with that, does anyone have any questions or any concerns? I'll wait a few seconds before I move on. So when we think of COVID-19, it's causing a lot of stress for many people and not as much for other people. And here's the reason why. For people who are experiencing a lot of stress is because of the the fear of uncertainty about life. What if I get COVID-19? Will I live or die? Will I have to be hospitalized? Financial stability. Will I lose my job? Will I be laid off? When will I get back into the workforce? If somebody's already lost their jobs. Fear for family, like if people have family members, living with them, or out other parts of the country or the city, concern about their welfare and their well-being, and again, concern about employment. Family, I can tell you, I had a client who was very anxious because they had their whole family live, the whole family lives in New York City, and so they were very anxious about like the uh, uh, the situation back there and how it could possibly affect, that person's elderly parents. So there are a lot of factors that are at this point in time causing a lot of anxiety, and I think what exacerbates that anxiety is the fact that we do not know when this will come to an end. We do not know, what we completely don't know what this virus is about, what harm it can do. Every week we're learning something new. Initially, we thought children could not be affected, but now children are being affected as well. So I think the fear of uncertainty is the core fear. And as Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist, and he wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. He talks about at the bottom of all fear is the fear of death or the fear of annihilation. So if you ask yourself this question, like, what will happen if I don't have money? Maybe the mind will say, well, you'll be homeless. What will happen if I'm homeless? Well, you could be attacked or so on and so forth. Of you won't have anything you want. You might not get enough food to eat, and then what will happen? I'll get a disease or something, or I'll die. So ultimately, it sort of all boils down to the fear of death, and nothing is stimulating that more than the times we're in right now because of the uncertainty. People are concerned about their 401ks, their financial status, and so on and so forth. Cool. So one of the things to remember here, and I injected this point, perceived versus real threat, is because a lot of the threats that we are perceiving or we're thinking about, let's say finances or 401k, we really need to sit back and ask ourselves, like in this moment, as I sit in my home or in my office right now, is my 401k really going down? Is that happening in this moment? And if that's not happening, why am I feeling as if it is happening right now? So that's a perception of threat. That's not an actual threat. An actual threat could be, you're walking and you're crossing the street and there's a car coming at you really fast. That's an actual threat. That and therefore your body is required to respond to that actual threat because that is real. And that actual and your bodily responses are that fight or flight mode, and which is fair. So fight and flight, for in this case, are really helpful to our survival. But what happens is, because of our perception of threat in this moment, of something that's not really a threat at this time, because we really don't have clear evidence that this is stressful or not, or if this is a danger to us or not. So for example, I would ask some people like who come into my office and they, all fearful, and I'm like, you know, if you look around this office, what do you feel like you are at, at danger of being harmed? And so they look around and they see like if maybe the fan is going to fall on me, or the lamp may collapse. Well, that's a possibility, but right now as you're sitting in this office, is that lamp really falling? Is there any evidence for that? So why are you thinking of that as if it is really happening, and therefore triggering your body to go into a fight or flight or a stress response? So it's really important to distinguish between real threat versus perceived threat. And frequently anxiety is connected to a lot of perceived threat, that this may happen. So there are certain things which are threatening, definitely. And so if those things are evidence based, then yes, you have to act on them. So distinguishing perceived versus real is, a real important point. Asking yourself, like, as I think of my 401k, as I think of my family, yes, there is certain danger to that, but as of now, from what I know, is that really happening? And if it's not happening, then maybe I will not, look at that thing as if it is an actual real danger happening right now. Because the moment you tell yourself that, your body goes into a stress response, which is frequently anxiety. All right, so with that being said, so the key point to take is noticing, asking yourself, as I walk my dog, as I sit in my house in this moment, whatever I'm thinking of, is that real or perceived danger, and how do I know that? Because I look for facts. That's why. And facts are not something like, I think it must be true. Do you really have evidence for that? Evidence is something that anybody could look at, a neutral party, and say, yep, this is evidence. So let me, right. So moving on to the polyvagal theory. So polyvagal theory was developed in the 90s by, he's a neuroscientist, Dr. Stephen Porges. And he talks about, our brain, so our nervous system is divided into, three parts. The brain is the central nervous system, then there is the peripheral nervous system, and then there's the autonomic nervous system. So we're going to talk about, the autonomic nervous system as it relates to the vagus nerve. So so what Dr. Porges, understood from his research is the 10th crane. So the 10th cranial nerve in the brain stem. So kind of like our lower base of our skull. So there are 12 sets of cranial nerves, and the 10th cranial nerve is the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve extends from the base of the skull all the way down. So you see these body organs. So it is connecting with your throat, it's connecting with your lungs, it's connecting with the heart, the stomach, the kidneys, spleen, also with your ears and facial muscles. And the vagus nerve is very important in terms of regulating a stress response. So you notice, like, when you are super anxious, your saliva dries up. That's a vagus nerve response. Or, like it's difficult to hear if you're like, maybe in a state of shock. It's difficult to perceive certain sounds. Or you feel like your stomach just fell. So those are all vagus nerve responses. So now if we think of the autonomic nervous system, there is the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So within the parasympathetic is responsible for, so autonomic nervous system in general is responsible for autonomic functions of the body, like breathing, digestion, and blood pressure, those kind of things. So within autonomic, there is parasympathetic and sympathetic. And within parasympathetic is responsible for relaxation, and then sympathetic nervous system is responsible for activation. So fight or flight is a sympathetic response. So within parasympathetic, we have the the vagus nerve. That's where we look at it. So vagus nerve has two parts. One is the dorsal vagal. So dorsal just means behind, and ventral is the front, or the forward one. So dorsal and ventral. And so the dorsal, so our brains developed for human beings, as we look at brain development from an evolutionary perspective. First came the lower brain, then came the midbrain, and then came the forebrain, or our thinking brain. So similarly, in the development of the parasympathetic nervous system, our means of defense, when we were like maybe not even human, we would frequently go into dorsal vagal response, which is a collapse response, a fainting response. So if you see possums, for example, or even certain animals like, I don't know, rabbits, or if you've seen those videos on National Geographic where the cheetah is running after the gazelle, and it's caught the gazelle, and for a moment the gazelle pretends as if it's dead, and as the cheetah is relaxed and not aware, the gazelle gets up and takes off. So that collapsing is a dorsal vagal response. In human beings, because when all of our other systems of defense don't work, then we relapse into this primitive way of survival. So you've seen, like, maybe in movies, for example, when somebody hears a really stressful news that they can't tolerate, they may fall or collapse. Other times in therapy, I've seen people who would dissociate, so they eject a certain experience because it's so stressful from their consciousness, or they're numb, they're feeling numb. So those are all dorsal vagal responses. So I'll go up now, starting with ventral vagus. So ventral vagus response is our preferred response, or a way of of defending ourselves, of protection. It's preferred because when we are in a ventral vagus response state, our heart rate is working fine, our body is working fine, and we are relaxed. Our breath is fine. So we really need to stay in the ventral vagus response. And the ventral vagal response is also called the social engagement, because we find safety in connection. And as I said earlier, the ventral vagus, so the ventral vagus system is sort of connected. It's primarily located the throat and above the throat, so face and ears. So what happens is when we are engaging in social connection, like talking to a really good friend, we are engaging in a ventral vagal response, because we are using our facial muscles, we are using our eyes, we are using our ears, we are using our throat, meaning our voice. So all of that is engaging our social engagement system, which is the ventral vagus system. And so that's keeping us safe. So So a little bit more detail about that. What that looks like is, so imagine like if something happens and you are not sure or it's really concerning to you, you know, frequently you'll check in with a colleague or with a friend or with someone else. So all of that is, again, connecting with another human being. Think about babies when they are connecting with their mothers. There is the look of, the look on the mother's face, the smile, the cooing from her mouth, and then the baby responding. So that's all ventral vagus. That's allowing the baby to feel safe, that it's safe and it's loved. And so that's the social engagement piece. So as long as that sort of dance happens and we allow that to happen, uh, we are engaging in our preferred way of survival. Uh, and anytime there is maybe something that's some experience that's adverse or traumatic, which kind of like which may sort of overrun the ventral vagus response, we then move on to the sympathetic nervous system response, which is the fight or flight response. And the idea is if our ventral vagus response system is well developed, our job is to come back to that state again by doing different exercises. And the next thing is, if let's say the sympathetic nervous system response also fails, then the next line of defense is the dorsal vagal response, which is immobilization. So dissociation, numbing, fainting, those kind of things, or depression, yeah, which is completely like low energy, just don't have energy to get up, do anything. Yeah. The question is the first system the only one where our conscious mind is active? So here's the thing. So, because I'm not going into full details of the polyvagal theory, because then this seminar will become a polyvagal theory seminar. There, so the ventral vagus response is frequently subconscious. The reason is there is so Dr. Porges has coined a term called neuroception. That is, subconscious awareness of the environment and our internal system. So it's not consciously thinking like, oh, am I safe, or oh, am I not safe? So let's say, for example, what do you like about meeting a close friend of yours? How do you know somebody's friendly? Because of their, the way they sound, the way they ask their questions, the look on their face, and their responsiveness, right? So that tells you like, so your mind is subconsciously picking up on that information coming from the environment, and it's also picking up information from within, like how you're feeling from within. So all of that is informing whether you're safe or not. And so a lot of this is happening at a subconscious level. So I'll give you an example, like in clients who've had a lot of like the ones I see, a lot of developmental trauma, like, maybe abusive family and things like that growing up. So what they have learned is, so what becomes a trigger for them is, as children, like this is a sort of, we're all organisms that, biological beings, and survival is our very basic instinct. So everything is overruled by our survival instinct. So when children or even adults are living in an environment where they feel they are under threat, so it could be domestic violence, it could be a child growing up in an environment that is threatening to them, like, the parents don't pay attention, there is neglect, there is abuse. So automatically the kids nervous system is cueing into the parents' face, the sound of their voice, the way that, there's a muscle called ocular something, which is kind of right around here. So they're really cueing into that to understand if they're under threat or not. And so that is and all of that is happening at a more subconscious level. It's happening really fast. So so a lot of this is, not happening at a conscious level. So in that sense. But however, we are conscious of, states that when we go into an uncomfortable state. We are more conscious of that, and then that tells us like we need to get back to our ventral vagal state. So engaging our social, social engagement system. So hopefully that kind of answers your question. So what we are conscious of, so so this is slightly outside of like polyvagal theory, but our conscious mind, the role of our conscious mind is to allow us to survive in the here and now. So and everything else is sort of behind the curtains, because if everything was in front of us, it'll be a a crazy mess. So there is a role of the conscious mind, and which is to allow us to survive, in the environment we are in the here and now, what we need to do. Yeah. So and so just like, and so therefore, there are things that are below the level of conscious perception that are happening all the time, and which is informing us and our bodies if we are safe or not. Yeah. Okay.
There is one more question. How can we stay in ventricle situation?
Yeah, so it's coming up now. Yeah, that'll be covered in a little bit. Yeah. All right. So next, okay. So this is just an example. So this is like a graph of because we're always going into all of these systems. Exist time. Are states that we engage in from time to time. It's not that we're always in in a ventral vagal state. It's preferred to be in that state, but that doesn't always happen. Like with COVID-19, we're frequently going into the fight or flight stage, which is which is sympathetic activation. And so how do you know you're in a flight, in a state of sympathetic activation synonymous with flight? So if so flight is fleeing the danger, so moving away from it, so that danger isn't of any danger to you anymore. And fight is you're fighting that threat, so it's no longer a threat to you. And so some of the responses connected with these two distinct sort of sympathetic responses are like with flight, there's a fear, there's panic, there is anxiety, there is worry, and there is concern. And with fight, there is anger, irritation, frustration, for example. And if you look at, and I'll cover like the impact of being in these states for too long, what happens in the next slide. But if you see, like, so for example, I'll give how we sort of vacillate between these states. So I wake up in the morning and I have nothing going on. It's a Saturday. I'm sitting and having my cup of coffee and looking outside the window. I'm in a ventral vagal state because and how I know that, because my heartbeat is relaxed. I'm breathing okay, and I don't have any sort of like negative thoughts that are causing my body to engage in a threat response. Yeah. So I'm in a ventral vagal state. And now I turn on the TV and I hear about, a doctor who committed suicide recently because she thought too much. And, I get into this fear space, a little bit of anxiety and fear and concern and worry. So then I might not go up here, but I enter that sympathetic state for a little bit. And then, so that happens. And then, I turn off the TV and I take a shower and I have my lunch and all my breakfast and all that. So I'm sort of back in that ventral vagus state. And now I meet a friend who, at a, let's say, social distancing coffee. And as I'm talking to them about something really important, they tend to they take their phone out and start looking at their phone. At that point, I shut down right here. And as a result of that, I stopped talking about what I wanted to talk to them about. My excitement drops. So I'm not panicking, I'm not angry, any of that, but I just shut down. So I just went into a dorsal vagal state. So we are constantly engaging in these states all the time. But the idea is to how can we stay in the social engagement or ventral vagus state as much as possible. So hopefully this clarifies that that once we all sort of, and these are all states of defense. It's our bodily system. It's our body system of protecting us. So we don't want to look at these states as like negative or bad or anything like that. If we want to say, like, as human beings, our preferred state is to stay in that ventral vagus state. And if that doesn't, work, then we enter the sympathetic followed by the dorsal vagal response. Stress is stress, right? Stress can come from COVID too, just because you're perceiving threat to your own safety, and the threat to your own safety is not having financial security, or somebody getting infected with COVID-19 who's close to you, and we don't know what might happen because we don't have a cure. So those are all threats. And so the social engage, so our job is to, we may go into a little bit of that sympathetic response, but if we can come back to that ventral vagus state, that's the goal. Yeah. And again, it's a threat response, right? So it could be, the threat response can be, in your work environment, or not knowing if your visa will come through, or you'll have to go do something else to make sure you can still stay legally in this country, things like that. So stress can come from different sources, but the key thing to remember is those things aren't stressful. It is how you react to them. That is what creates the stress. So for example, COVID-19 isn't coming and like threatening you, but your perception of COVID-19 is what is engaging you in any of these three states. That's why we see different people responding differently to the same threat, yeah, or the same environmental stimuli, to be more scientific. Okay. So now we'll look at the ventral vagal activation. So what happens when we stay in a ventral vagal activated state? So it's healthy heart rate, regulated blood pressure, immune system is doing well, a decreased vulnerability to stress, there's better digestion, good quality of sleep, and there's an overall sense of well-being. Sympathetic activation, it's more fight or flight. So if we stay in a more, so there is nothing wrong in going into a sympathetic activated state and then going back to a ventral state. But if we stay in a sympathetic activation state longer than we need to and frequently, then so maybe like a stressful job, quote unquote, where you're always expected to perform and you feel like nothing is good enough, and you're always sort of weighing yourself down because you're afraid, like, well, if I don't do this, my boss is going to fire me, or I might lose this. So that can put you in in a more sympathetically activated state. And so that takes a toll on the body, and therefore some of the consequences of that can be, heart disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, sleep problems, weight gain, memory impairment, like can't remember, headaches, chronic neck and shoulder back tension, stomach problems, and the depression and depressing, and this depresses your immune system, which can make you more vulnerable to illnesses as well. So therefore, at this time, it's even more important to not be in any of these sympathetic or dorsal vagal states, because your immune system is really important. Yeah, that's what's protecting you from COVID-19. Dorsal vagal activation, again, that is when fight and flight isn't doing it, or maybe there is no chance for fighting or fleeing something, and you're staying in that state of stuckness, of being stuck. It can lead to certain bodily conditions or put you at higher risk for things like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, stomach problems, low blood pressure, diabetes, weight gain, dissociation, problems with memory, depression, isolation, having no energy, no motivation, those kind of things. So again, know that just because you dipped into these states will not mean that you're going to have all of this. It's the longer you stay in this state for a prolonged period of time, you're at higher risk of these illnesses. So that's what it means. Deep breathing, we talk about deep breathing being such a common thing. Like you probably have heard about deep breathing from many people, like take a deep breath, relax, for example. And there is a deeper meaning to why we do deep breathing. So some of the reasons are like when you are anxious, when you're in a fight or flight state, or a sympathetic state, your body tends to contract because it's getting ready to fight or flee. So there is more adrenaline in your body. There's contraction of muscles. There is blood rushing from your stomach, for example, to your extremities, so you can fight or you can run, flee. And and so your so deep breathing helps with giving messages to your brain that it is okay, because you're doing the opposite of what fight or flight are making your body do. So deep breathing is helpful in that way. But as far as the vagus nerve goes, because the vagus nerve is connected to the throat, to the lungs as well, so you're activating the vagus nerve by filling the lungs with air, with lots of air, and that is engaging the vagus nerve. And so the vagus nerve is sending messages back to the brain that it's safe or safer, and so that helps relax. um, so connected to deep breathing is also humming, which I found very helpful with especially people who have panic attacks, or like who go into this sort of uh, fight or flight sort of panic state really fast. Is you take a deep breath in, you hold for a few seconds, and then you very slowly exhale by humming from your mouth. So I take a deep breath in, my rib cages expand, my lungs fill with air, and then I do like a and so really slowly until the air is completely exhausted, it's out. So you can do that a couple times or as many times as you need till you check in with your body and you notice like, okay, I'm feeling better now. So that's good. Yoga is helpful, yoga in coordination with breath. So specifically certain postures like the cat cow posture. So which is the first image, the image with the the woman in maroon yoga pants. So that's the cat cow posture, and you can Google it too, and you'll see that. So coordinating that with breath, the warrior pose, which is another diagram I have, a picture of I have down here on the slide. Yoga nidra, which is just sort of more shavasana, just laying for 30 minutes, allowing your body to sort of go into that vagus state. All right. Because vagus nerve also connect with are connected to our facial muscles. So when you're splashing cold water on your face or holding a Ziploc filled with ice and putting it on your face with briefly holding your breath, releasing it as you kind of keep that ice on your face, that helps to also get into a less activated state. So these are things which are like in the moment that you can do. Holding lukewarm water in the mouth and submerging your tongue in it, that can also be helpful to activate the vagus nerve. Social connection can't emphasize any less how important that is. Social connection, as I had spoken again in the just in a few slides ago, where the way you look at someone, the tone of your voice, the expressions on your face, those are all simulated when you're socially connecting with other people. Like when you're looking at a computer, at that point there is no social connection because you're not animated at that point in time. So social connection is really important, and especially in the times of COVID-19 where you can't physically meet people. If you are meeting people, let's say online for virtual happy hours or virtual meetings, you can intentionally Pay attention to the tone of your voice, to the expressions on your face, making sure you're emoting them, and that'll help, reduce that social connection, the way our body language is when we're actually with someone. So this is a way to sort of adapt to the times we are in, where we are connecting more through the internet. So making sure that the way we look at the computer screen isn't the same as when we are working or creating a Word document, because our minds are trained, because we've all been working on using computers for a very long time. We don't normally hold expressions when we're looking at a computer screen. So it's important that we sort of make sure we emote, we express using our face. We use the tone of our voice. That's important too. That the tone of our voice communicates that I care, whatever is culturally appropriate in that sense. So in that, so these are some exercises, and then butterfly tapping. So some other exercises are butterfly tapping is you can bring your left hand over your right arm or your right shoulder, and the right hand over your left arm or your left shoulder. And then you just tap 25 times, like 1, 2, 3, alternate tapping, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You don't have to count, I'm just counting. And then when you're done 25, just take a deep breath, dive into your body and notice. If you notice like you are relaxed, but you could still relax a bit more, do another set of 25, take a deep breath, notice the parts of your body that are holding tension. How do they feel right now? If they still feel tense, you can do another set of 25 and take a deep breath and then notice again. Progressive muscle relaxation can be done with or without tensing any muscle groups. So the script for progressive muscle relaxation, which, with tensing the muscle group, is available online. All you need to do is just Google it. But essentially what you're doing is you're tensing a muscle, holding it in that tense position for 5 seconds, and then you're releasing it. So you're working muscle groups from your head down to your feet, basically. So tensing, relaxing. Yeah. So that's with when you add tension, when you add tensing to it. Otherwise, you could be just laying in bed and you could just visualize. You can take parts of your body. So for example, I'll take from the tip of my toes to my knees, and I'll tell myself that all the muscles are just relaxing and they're falling onto the mattress or whatever that I'm resting on. And then I'm going to move on and say from my hips to my knees, all the muscles are relaxing and my thighs are feeling heavy because they're so relaxed. Then so on and so forth. I just keep moving up. So that's more progressive muscle relaxation and relaxation. There's also an exercise called container, in which it's very simple. What you do there is you think of a container. It could be a real or imagined container, a container in which you can put things and lock it, seal or lock it. So if you notice like you're getting into this activated state and you're maybe out in public and you can't do anything, that'll call your attention or call other people's attention. So you can just visualize that. Your first thing to do is notice where the tension is in your body, and then visualize that tension is turning into a color, and hold the intention that the color, all of that color is going into your container of choice, and that it's gone into that container. And once it's all there, you close the container tight and lock it or seal it and put it away. So what that does is it'll bring about a little bit more a sense of relief. It may not completely take away anxiety, but will reduce it. And then other things, of course, meditation, yoga, exercise. Exercise is excellent because it stimulates, sort of oxytocins and some, so these sort of happy hormones, as they call, that help improve mood. So self-compassion is, I'll just, Thich Nhat Hanh is a Vietnamese, so TNH stands for Thich Nhat Hanh. So he is a Vietnamese social activist and a monk, and he's written many books and full of wisdom. So these are some of his quotes, which I really like. So so connected to self-compassion, there is a quote in which he's saying, if we do not know how to take care of ourselves and to love ourselves, we cannot take care of other people we love. Loving oneself is the foundation for loving another person. So, which is sort of somewhat, can be an alien concept depending on which culture you come from. So in certain cultures, certain religion, people are taught to like care for other people and, at their own cost, for example. You got to take care of your neighbor, no matter what what cost. So there is no training in taking care of yourself as well. So there's a lack of information in that regard. And I think that's where self-compassion is so important. There's a Buddhist saying, or where they say, like, compassion isn't complete without the self. So the self is a really important piece to compassion, and we all have compassion. It's natural to us. When babies are born, they are naturally compassionate. Nobody has to teach them compassion. Over time, as we grow older, we get programmed by society, social expectations, and that can create layers or conditions for our compassion to flow towards self or others. So this exercise of self-compassion is to, or this understanding of self-compassion is to allow us to reconnect with ourselves, with the compassion that's natural to us. So this definition is something that I just made up because I couldn't find anything succinct on self-compassion. So self-compassion involves the mindful observation of one's state of suffering and offering the same kindness to oneself that one would offer to a dear person or someone dear to you, while holding the awareness that suffering is a universal phenomena. There's a little typo over there. So, and I'll break the definition down into 3 parts. Okay. So before I get into the different aspects of self-compassion in sort of like the Western context in psychotherapy, psychology, Kristin Neff, and let's see. So Kristin Neff right here, where my pointer is, Neff and Germer 2017. So Kristin Neff, she's the one who developed, not developed, but I would say she borrowed ideas from Buddhism and Western psychology to create, self-compassion, or package it in a way that's true to self-compassion, but it's easily digestible sort of to the Western audience. And I find it really helpful. So she did a lot of research on self-compassion, and here are some sort of outcomes. So the first bullet point talks about, the impact of self-compassion, that it's in research studies, it shows it's correlated to improving overall mental well-being. It reduces anxiety, depression, perfectionism, increases overall happiness, motivation. So think about all of this and think about the staying in a ventral vagus state. Self-compassion can reduce sympathetic activity, which is fight or flight, and bring increased ventral vagal flexibility in responding to stressful situations, which means you're frequently defaulting to that ventral vagus state. And also important to realize is self-criticism activates the ancient defense system that takes a person out of safety into a state of survival. So our ancient defense system is the dorsal vagal defense system. The dissociation, the fainting, the depression, and all that, followed by fight or flight. Yeah. And increased ventral vagal activity is linked to compassion and self-compassion, and both are strengthened with regular practice. So self-compassion isn't a one-time thing, it's a practice. You need to be doing this in, frequently, because our brains are neuroplastic. So our brains are plastic, meaning like based on the experiences we give ourselves, that's how our brains are shaped. So if you're giving ourselves through, let's say, the practice of self-compassion, or through the different activities we discussed earlier, when you're giving yourself that experience again and again, you're training your brain to be in that state. So therefore, practice is very important. So the three components of self-compassion, the first one is called mindfulness. So mindfulness, people have heard mindfulness, it's the buzzword these days. Schools are practicing mindfulness, everybody's talking about mindfulness, but what is mindfulness? So John Kabat-Zinn, he was he's not a physician, but a scientist at I think Massachusetts General, to the Mass General Systems in Boston. So he studied with the Zen monks, and brought sort of Zen Buddhism, or was responsible for making it popular in the West in the early 90s. And so his definition of mindfulness is being in the present moment without judgment. In other words, non-reactive present moment awareness. So what does that look like? Because our minds are always like, there's a term for the mind. It's called the monkey mind, because it's always jumping from, just like a monkey that jumps from one tree to another, our mind is always jumping from one thought to another. There is no sort of intentional flow or regulation of that, generally speaking. So mindfulness is basically being aware of what's happening in this moment with you, so that it then gives you a choice. If you're aware of what's happening, that's when you have a choice. If you're not aware, then you have no choice. So the first prerequisite to mindfulness, so self-compassion, is awareness. What's actually happening to me in this moment? And that awareness has to be non-judgmental. That's an important piece to it. And non-judgmental means, where you are looking at it as an observer. You're not being with it, but you're just observing it. What would that mean? That would mean that, so the analogy is that, so I have this picture of, two people on a kayak. So if you were to imagine this lake that they're on as the lake of emotions, had they been swimming in it, then they would not be in a mindful place, because they are over, I don't want to say attached, they are in the emotions. So they're experiencing that anxiety. They're not wanting to be in that place. They're having, judgmental thoughts about themselves or others, as they're experiencing, let's say, that particular emotion, for example, anxiety. So that would not be mindful. Versus, so this image represents them as being in a mindful place, where they're on that emotion, but they're not in it. They're not getting wet in it. They're not running away from it, but they're navigating it. So they're observers of that lake of emotions, and they're navigating their way through it without getting wet. So, and that happens through observation. So the mind's ability to stay in the present moment, to observe what's happening, is, in this case, very simplistically put, mindfulness. So one thing to remember is, even animal like dogs are, like when they're running after a ball, they are in the present moment, but they're not mindful, because they're not aware of, what's happening to them in that moment, what faculties are working, what are the thoughts that are coming and going, and all of those things. So there's a difference between being in the present moment in that sense, right? Yeah. So in the case of self-compassion, how mindfulness comes into play is, we need to be aware of, okay, in this moment, as I'm thinking of, let's say, What will happen to my, my family? What am I noticing in my body right now? I'm noticing that my breath is becoming shallow. I'm noticing that I have the emotion of sadness that's coming up. I have the emotion of maybe anger, frustration, so on and so forth. So that is mindful awareness. And so what really helps with that is if we are able to use impersonal language. So impersonal language is it's a moment of let's say anxiety. It's a moment of suffering. It's a moment of tension. Whatever word you know feels right to you to describe what you're going through in this moment. So staying away from using words like I am feeling this or I am that, because that'll bring you closer to getting wet in that water. So mindful awareness, just take a pause, deep breath, look within to see what's going on in this moment. What are you thinking? Maybe you have some critical thoughts. So just recognize that and say it's a moment of self-criticism. It's a moment of anger or frustration, those kind of things. So you're naming your state in that present moment without actually being in that state, meaning like you're not attaching yourself to that state, but you're observing it and naming it. The next part is common humanity, and that again comes from um, that Kristin Neff draws from Buddhism, where if you look at the Four Noble Truths, the first truth is life is suffering, and life is suffering for everyone. If you're born as a human being on this earth, life is suffering because you have to fend for yourself. You get old, you get disease, people die, those kind of things. So nobody can escape that. So let's see. Is there a question? Okay, no.
There, there
Yeah,
is a question.
sure.
Is is snoring related to stress?
Mm, it could be. So sometimes if you're gaining, let's say if sometimes people, and stress can lead to, this is just one example, stress can lead to, let's say, comfort eating, where you feel less stress when you eat, and now you've gained weight. And some of that weight has gone into your, like your neck area. And now you have sleep apnea, which is frequently connected to snoring. So there is a connection in that sense. So you have to ask yourself, like, what's going be that mindful awareness as to what's going on with me and what is the cause of this snoring for me. Has anything changed? Was I not snoring? When was the last time when I experienced a prolonged period of not snoring? And when did it start? So when you examine that period, and you analyze what's going on in your life around that time, that can give you some cues as to if this snoring is more physiological and has nothing to do with stress, or or stress is an important component of that. So yeah, sometimes it can just be physiological. Yeah. Other times it can be, a direct result of stress. So for example, stress eating, right? Yeah. So in that sense. So the next one is common humanity. So common humanity is the understanding that the experience of, ourselves, or the what we are going through, is a large part of the human experience. So in case of COVID-19, if I'm experiencing threat to my own safe financial safety, to the safety of my friends, uh, to the safety of my friends, or to my 401k, you're telling yourself that, wait a minute, in this moment in time, I don't think I'm the only one experiencing that kind of stress. And there are other people experiencing the same kind of stress, and these are people I may or may not personally know, but that doesn't mean that they are not experiencing any stress. So what common humanity does is, frequently when we suffer, we tend to isolate ourselves. We think like, I'm the only one that this is happening to, and everybody else is doing fine. So what Common Humanity does is it shifts your perspective and says, wait a minute, you're not the only one. Since everybody is suffering, because they're that's part of human existence. So what should really be joining me with others is our common suffering. I don't need to isolate myself and think I'm the only one. I mean, think about it. I joke with my clients. I'm saying there's only one, one thing that somebody has ever done that's so unique. It's the original sin, like as they talk in the Bible, like Adam and Eve and eating that apple. Nobody has ever done that. So there's nothing that's like the original sin. Everybody goes through anxiety, everybody goes through depression and those kind of things. So it's not a unique thing to you. So what Common Humanity does, therefore, is to shift your perspective and make the problem look a little smaller, and also sort of provides hope, because you're not the only one. And then the last component is self-kindness, which is sort of synonymous with the word self-compassion. So so if you look at a spectrum, self-kindness is on one end and self-criticism is on the other end. So we want to move from that self-critical end to the self-kind end. What that looks like is you're offering kindness to yourself, and which would mean that you're treating yourself as kindly as you would treat someone who you really care about deeply, had they come with the same problem or issue to you. So like if you really care for, let's say, your own child or your own parent or your partner, and if they were to come to you and say like, hey, this is really stressing me out, imagine how you would respond to them. And then we go and we think about the ventral vagus response, the sound of your voice, right? Does your voice communicate softness? Does it communicate caring? The facial expressions, yeah, and gentle touch, those kind of things. So self-kindness, as a very simplistically put, is treating yourself just the same way you would treat somebody who you deeply care for, if they came up to you and said that they were suffering with anxiety or whatnot. Yeah. And as I said earlier, that because we're not trained to be kind to ourselves, it can initially be difficult. So what we do is we imagine a friend, who we care about deeply, and that friend is telling us like, this is what's happened and I'm really sad. And then you are responding to them. And once you have responded, you just turn that response inward towards you. So that's one way of sort of engaging yourself in that practice of self-kindness. Frequently, gentle touch is a thing that goes with self-kindness, because when we provide ourselves with gentle touch, being mammals, our brain is naturally wired to generate oxytocin, which is our bonding chemical in the brain. So when a mother and a child play with each other, oxytocin is created, which helps for that bonding to happen. If oxytocin was not, if it did not get created during this playful activity, bonding between mother and child would be very difficult. So our bodies are naturally sort of geared to respond to gentle touch by the secretion of oxytocin. So gentle touch could be whatever is gentle touch for you. If you're doing self-compassion for yourself, frequently people bring their hands to their heart center, to center of their chest, or maybe a gentle self-hug, or whatever feels gentle, gentle touch to you. And you don't have to think like, okay, I've touched myself now gently, and now there should be oxytocin secreted. That's a very automatic process. It just happens on its own. You don't have to think about it. So these are the three components of self-compassion. And how do you now, so these can be, so there are many exercises, but I'll just sort of like practice one with you. so that it really sort of hits home and it's clear to you. And we'll do that in we'll finish it in 2 or 3 minutes at the most. So we leave enough time for question and answers. So what I would invite you all to do is think about maybe a recent situation that is somewhat distressing to you. So you don't want to think of something that's like, a 10 out of 10 on the distress scale, but something that's more of a 4 or a 5. 10 means extremely distressing and 5 means in the middle. So kind of like a 5. So I'll give you like maybe 10 seconds to think about that. And so as you bring that situation to your mind, bring your awareness. So we're now practicing the mindful piece. Bring your awareness to your body and notice, what are you experiencing in this moment. Locate spaces in your body or parts of your body that feel tense or uncomfortable as you think of that memory. Notice the emotions behind that tension. Name the emotion. Is it tension? Is it sadness, frustration, anger, anxiety? If it's fear, it's normally anxiety. But you can choose your own, whatever feels right. So we'll give it another 10 seconds. So you're just scanning your body quickly to check what parts of my body are tense and what's the emotion that this tension is communicating. And now what you're going to do is name, using impersonal language, name what you just observed. It's a moment of, you can name that feeling, you can name that body sensation, and if it feels right, you can just say it's a moment of suffering, whatever feels right. So staying away from I am anxious or I am sad, but it's a moment of. And now you go down to the common humanity piece. So ask yourself, like at this point in time, the emotions that you're experiencing, are these emotions unique to you only and nobody else experiences these emotions? Is that really true? That you're the only one? And the situation that's inviting these negative emotions, are you the only one who's ever experienced these, that kind of situation? Or are there other people as well that you may or may not know? So you ask yourself that question. And normally the answer will be, nope, I don't think I'm alone. There are many people I may not know. So just breathe that awareness in. So take a nice deep breath and just with the intention of breathing that awareness in. And then we move down to the loving kindness piece, or the self kindness piece. So you could use your hands and put them anywhere on your body that communicates gentle touch, compassionate touch for you. It could be on your shoulders. So like I bring it to the center of my heart. Yeah. So my heart chakra, as they call, some people might call it that spot. And then you close your eyes with the intention that you are only going to listen to your heart. And if the mind comes in, you're going to not not ignore it, but just acknowledge it and go back to the heart. And you know that the mind is coming in because if you have to think for a response, then normally it's the mind. So the self-kindness piece is, you close your eyes, you imagine, you visualize your heart, and then you ask yourself this question: what do I need in this moment of suffering to be just kind to myself? And just wait for whatever to happen to happen. You're not thinking for a response. What do I need to give myself in this moment of suffering or whatever emotion that you noticed to be really kind and gentle to myself? And again, staying with your body and your heart, not thinking for an answer. And there is no right or wrong way of doing this. Cool. So with that being, so after doing that, I would look, I'll check in with people as far as what they got and what their responses were. So feel free to type if anything came up for you that you wish to express. And while you do that, I will so what we just did is called the self-compassion break, which you can do anytime in light of, a moment when you're suffering. Self-compassion journaling is pretty much the same, where you mindfully observe. So let's say something happened that brought in negative emotions. You think of that event, you write down what's coming up for you in your body and emotions. Then you do the common humanity piece where you write down like, wait a minute, is it true that I'm the only one? And if there's an anecdote or if there's an example in your mind that helps with that common humanity piece, you can write that down. And the last piece of self-kindness is, what would you say to a friend if they had the same concerns that you had, or experiencing the same thing that you were? So you just write down that response and then turn it in words. And then there's the loving kindness meditation, which if you Google, I have some resources at the end, and so you can access the loving kindness meditation through that by clicking on that, by clicking on the link, or like just Googling that specific resource, and you'll find it. And so loving kindness meditation can be anywhere between 9 to 17 minutes, and it's essentially developing a relationship with ourselves through compassion. Yeah. All right. So any questions on self-compassion? Or the practice of self-compassion? And one of the things, as you're thinking of questions, so one of the things to clarify is self-compassion doesn't tell you to be complacent. It doesn't make you complacent. It's just saying that it's acknowledging that you're doing the best you can, and that you will continue to do, you'll continue to work towards that problem without putting any expectations like this is where you have to be. Because the moment you do that, then the self-criticism comes in if you're not able to achieve that. So self-compassion says, I appreciate what you're doing for your, what you've done and what you're doing, and and you'll continue to sort of work at it. And so it's encouraging you without punishing you or without being critical of you. Yeah, because that criticism can frequently take us into that sympathetic response or dorsal vagal response. So as you're thinking of your response or your questions, I want to say, like, these are some great resources for meditation, heartfulness.org. What I really love about this this organization is because they also have an app where you can actually do meditation with a live person, and it's free. So I use this all the time. Self-compassion. So some of the descriptions I gave, the exercises I mentioned, they're all here on selfcompassion.org. It's Kristin Neff's website. For mindfulness-based, meditations and things like that, these are two websites where you can access mindfulness resources for free. So one is through Stanford University and the other is through UCLA. Yoga, there is Yoga with Adriene, which is pretty popular in the YouTube world, and and she's fantastic. It's, it's all free yoga, so you can sit at home and watch Adrienne teach you. And Seva, I would say, Seva has, I think every Friday they're doing a mental health consultation. So it's with me. So from 11 to 12, so you need to contact Seva to book a time slot, and then I can sort of do more confidential consultation. Yeah. So it's not psychotherapy, it's just consultation and problem solving. Yeah.
Seva is humbly thanking
Mhm.
you for this.
I mean, I don't think like, and I feel like this is something we need to do for each other. So, if anybody, can maybe even if they choose to do one thing and it's helpful, then that's great. Yeah. And then exposure to this knowledge allows other people to, transmit that further on and help other people too. So absolutely. And I'm grateful for Seva to give, for allowing me to have this platform.
We are grateful to you. Yeah.